Welcome to Tales from South Florida, the podcast where we look at the people, the places, and the events that help shape our corner of the Sunshine State. I'm your host, Bill Monty, and in this episode, we're asking the question, what's in a name? Specifically, the names of Broward, Dade, and Monroe, as in counties. Sorry, Palm Beach County, but we think we know how you got your name. Who are the people that these counties are named after? What did they contribute? And why are they still so important today? Let's get started.
These are the tales from South Florida for you, with your host, Bill Monty.
You know, I'm the curious type. Maybe that's why I started this podcast, right? I mean, I'm always asking, well, why is this that? How did that get its name? Where did this come from? And I think I've thought about that over the years when it comes to the names of the counties that I'm familiar with in Florida, specifically the ones in South Florida. I mean, there's something about saying those names that feels automatic if you spent any time down here. I mean, you hear them in traffic reports, weather updates, real estate listings, even in the way people describe where they're from. Yeah, I grew up in Dade. I'm up in Broward now. I'm heading down to Monroe for the weekend. But how often do we stop and ask, well, who were these people? Because these are not just lines on a map. They're stories. Stories about ambition, conflict, expansion. Stories that stretch from the earliest days of Florida as an American territory, through war, through uncertainty, and into the boom years that shaped the South Florida that we talk about and that we know today. So we're going to slow things down a bit and take a closer look at Broward, Dade, and Monroe, because once you know the stories behind the names, you'll never quite hear them the same way again. Let's start at the bottom of the map. Monroe County, the Florida Keys, Key West, that stretch of islands that feels like it belongs to another world entirely. Monroe County is actually the oldest of the three established counties, and it's named after... Any guesses, anybody? Yeah, you in the back. That's correct. James Monroe, the 5th president of the United States. Now, Monroe himself never lived in South Florida. He never walked Duval Street. Would have been kind of crazy if he did. He never stood on a dock in Key West watching the sun go down, but his presidency did mark a turning point. In 1821, just a couple of years before Monroe County was formed, Spain officially transferred Florida to the United States. Now, think about that for a moment. Florida wasn't always Florida as we know it. It was Spanish, then briefly British, then it was Spanish again, and finally, it was part of America. And Monroe was the president when that happened. So naming a county after him was not about local ties. It was about identity, about claiming this new territory as part of a growing nation. And Monroe County, especially Key West, became incredibly important almost immediately. Not for tourism, not back then. There were no margaritas and sunset cruises. Instead, it was all about location, location, location. Key West sat along major shipping routes, and in the 1800s, when ships wrecked on the reefs, which happened quite often, those wrecks became opportunity. There were salvage crews known as wreckers who would recover cargo and claim a portion of its value. At one point, Key West was one of the wealthiest cities per capita in the United States, all because of those shipwrecks. So Monroe County represents the very beginning of Florida's American chapter, a time when this place was still being defined. It was still being figured out. A time when South Florida was not yet South Florida. It was just the distant edge of a young and expanding country. Now let's move up the map into what was once known simply as Dade County. I know, hold on. If you're not from here, today it's Miami-Dade County. But that Dade carries a story that's a lot heavier than most people realize. And I've actually touched on this in a previous episode. If you go back to the story of the Cooley Massacre, a little bit of the story in here is part of that story also. The county was named after Major Francis L. Dade, a U.S. Army officer, and his name is tied to one of the most dramatic and tragic events in Florida history, In December of 1835, Dade was leading a column of about 100 soldiers through the Florida wilderness. They were marching from the Tampa area toward Fort King, which is now present-day Ocala. At the time, tensions between the United States and the Seminole people were reaching a breaking point. And then somewhere along that route, everything changed. Seminole warriors ambushed Dade's column. It was swift and it was decisive, and nearly every soldier in that group was killed. That moment became known as the Dade Battle, and it didn't just end there. It sparked the Second Seminole War, a conflict that would drag on for years and become one of the longest and most expensive wars the United States fought against Native American tribes. So when Dade County was established in 1836, it was named in honor of Major Dade and the soldiers who died with him. Because this is not just a story of heroism, let's take a moment to pause here. It's a story about displacement, of resistance, of a people, the Seminoles, fighting to remain on their land. And that tension is part of South Florida's foundation. For decades after that, Dade County remained largely undeveloped. It was remote. It was difficult to access. When the traffic's bad on I-95, it's still difficult to access. It was a place of dense wilderness, scattered settlements, and long distances between those settlements. It wouldn't be until much later, railroads, roads, and the arrival of industry, that Dade would begin to transform into what we now know as Miami and its surrounding communities. And in 1997, the name officially changed to Miami-Dade County, blending the modern identity of the region with its historical roots. But that original name still echoes every time someone says Dade County. Okay, let's hop in the car and move north to Broward County. And if Monroe represents beginnings and Dade represents conflict, Broward represents transformation. Broward County was established in 1915, carved out of what was then Dade County. And it was named after, get this, Napoleon Bonaparte Broward. Yeah, that was his real name. And frankly, I think we should have stuck with that for the name of the county. Napoleon Bonaparte Broward County. Has a certain ring to it, don't you think? Napoleon Bonaparte Broward was Florida's governor from 1905 to 1909. Before that, he was a riverboat captain, kind of cool. A man who knew Florida's waterways intimately. And he had a vision. He believed the Everglades, the vast, slow-moving river of grass that covered much of South Florida, could be drained. Not partially, but significantly. Turned into farmland, turned into buildable land. At the time, the Everglades were seen by many as just useless swamp, something to conquer, something to convert into something productive. And Broward made that idea the centerpiece of his political campaign, drained the Everglades. And once he became governor, he got to work. Canals were dug, water was redirected, land began to dry. And that effort laid the groundwork for the development of places like Fort Lauderdale, and much of Broward County as we know it today. But like many big ideas, it came with consequences. Environmental consequences that we're still trying to understand and address today. The Everglades wasn't just empty land. It was and is a delicate ecosystem, one that doesn't easily adapt to being reshaped. So Broward's legacy is, shall we say, complicated, right? On one hand, he did help open South Florida to large-scale settlement and growth. On the other, that transformation came at a cost, a price we're still paying today. And when Broward County was named in his honor, it reflected how significant that transformation was and how much it reshaped the region. So when you line these three counties up, Monroe, Dade, Broward, you're not just looking at lines on a map, at geography. You're looking at a timeline. Monroe County takes us back to the early 1800s when Florida became part of the United States. Dade County brings us into a period of conflict where control of the land was still being fought over. And Broward County moves us into the 20th century, where engineering and ambition began reshaping the landscape itself. It's a progression, from wilderness to conflict to transformation. And today, millions of people live, work, and move throughout these counties every single day, often without thinking about the stories behind their names. But those stories, they're still there. In the canals that cut through our neighborhoods, in the roads that follow old paths, in the very shape of the land itself. If you grew up in South Florida, these names are part of your vocabulary before you even realize it. You learned them the way you learn directions. As a matter of fact, they help us learn directions. North means Broward. South means Dade. Further south, that means Monroe. There's something powerful about knowing where those names come from, because it connects us to something bigger, to history that didn't just happen somewhere else. It happened right here, on the same ground, along the same coastlines, under the same sun that make South Florida so unique. It's not just a place people move to. It's a place layered with stories, with tales waiting to be remembered. 3 names, 3 stories, 3 counties, 1 South Florida. Hey, at this point, I would like to do a special shout out to one of our listeners on the Space Coast of Florida, Joe and his incredible wife, who, because they're asking us not to say their names, I'll call Mrs. Joe. Mrs. Joe found our series and thought enough of it to share it with Joe, who grew up right here in South Florida. Joe was kind enough to reach out to me through our email, talesfromsouthflorida@gmail.com, to tell me how much he and his wife enjoyed the series. He reminisced a little bit about some of the places that he knew growing up here. He grew up in the Dania area, now known as Dania Beach, and talked about some of the locales that he went to, some of the places that he would hang out. Mentioned 2 of them that I used to hang out in, Nick's and Ocean's 11 on Hollywood Beach. I wonder if Joe and I were ever at those places at the same time and didn't even know it. Thanks, Joe. I appreciate you reaching out, because that's how these stories travel, one person at a time. And I'm so glad that you and your wife are listening. Please continue to do so. If you enjoyed this episode of Tales from South Florida, please take a moment to help us grow our storytelling community. Be sure to subscribe, comment, share. Hey, leave a review, because that kind of support helps others discover the stories that make South Florida so special. Until the next time we take a talk down memory lane together, I invite you to visit us at talesfromsouthflorida.com, where you can visit our YouTube channel, listen to our Spotify playlist, and catch up on all the audio tales from South Florida. Until then, my friends, I remind you to please be safe, be a friendly Floridian, and be kind.
Let's take a talk down memory lane, 'cause the stories around here are just insane. Pirates World, the Sporto and Wolfies too, Palm Beach to Key West, that's where we grew. These are the tales from South Florida for you, with your host Bill Monty.
Hello, friends. Bill Monty here, and I'm inviting you to join me on the podcast, Bill Monty's Guide for Getting Older. Now, this is not a podcast about being old. No, it's about understanding the world we're growing older in, how we care for each other, how we protect what we've built, and how we make sense of the systems that are supposed to look out for us, especially when we need them the most. Bill Monty's Guide for Getting Older. It is available wherever fine podcasts can be found, and I look forward to talking with you soon.